The ballroom was filled with a low hum of chatter, the kind of ambient noise that had become familiar to Carter Wells over the years. The grand chandelier above reflected the golden light onto the polished marble floors, casting long, shimmering reflections that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. It was the perfect setting for a night that was all about appearances. Carter stood near the center of the room, a glass of champagne delicately held in his hand as he nodded and smiled at well-dressed strangers, his mind elsewhere. He was used to these events, to the endless parade of high society gatherings where connections were made, deals were brokered, and people like him, self-made billionaires with an air of mystery, were always the center of attention. At 42, Carter had everything he ever wanted: a towering business empire, sprawling homes on multiple continents, and a reputation that preceded him. But as he scanned the room, accepting the compliments from one admirer to the next, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The truth was, Carter had long ago buried any hope of finding fulfillment in personal relationships. His marriage had fallen apart years ago, not because of infidelity, but because they had simply grown apart. His ex-wife, Nina, had never truly understood his obsessive drive to succeed. She hadn't been interested in the quiet loneliness that came with his ambition, nor had she understood why he couldn't stop chasing more and more and more. And after Sophie, their daughter, had been taken, and the case had gone cold, he hadn't been able to find the strength to try again. He had lost the only family he had ever cared about, and somewhere along the way, he stopped trying to rebuild. He was content to keep his life simple. Wealth was his comfort, power his solace. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite put his finger on, he felt uneasy. Maybe it was the quiet ache that lingered in his chest when he saw other fathers with their children at the gala, or maybe it was the realization that his life had become a series of hollow encounters. Even his children, Lily and Max, seemed like distant memories at times, fleeting visits when his schedule allowed. Carter's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, high-pitched voice that cut through the background noise. The words rang out, sharp and full of certainty, slicing through the air with the clarity of a bell. Carter's brow furrowed as his gaze snapped across the room, momentarily unsure whether he had heard the words correctly. The voice had come from a small boy standing near the center of the ballroom. The child was barely old enough to be away from his mother, no older than 5. His hair was a little messy, his clothes simple, nothing like the polished image of the other children at the event. He stood with his tiny hand pointed directly at Carter. The moment seemed to stretch on indefinitely, the room falling into an uncomfortable silence as people turned their heads, some with curiosity, others with judgment. Carter felt a wave of heat rise to his face, though he wasn't sure if it was embarrassment or confusion. He glanced around, hoping to find the source of the child's outburst, and his eyes landed on the boy's mother. She was standing behind him, a woman in her early 30s, wearing a modest yet elegant dress that didn't draw attention to her. Her face was pale, almost fragile, and her eyes were wide, betraying a mixture of anxiety and determination. She seemed familiar, but Carter couldn't place her. He blinked and quickly tried to regain his composure. For a moment, Carter thought perhaps the child had been mistaken. Kids say strange things sometimes. The boy could have been confused, or worse, this was some sort of stunt, a prank designed to make a spectacle of him in front of the guests. Yet, as the seconds passed, something about the situation unsettled him. The child was staring directly at him with a certainty that didn't belong in the world of high society frivolity. It was raw, unfiltered, and full of an innocence that didn't belong in this world of polished veneers. As the whispers in the crowd began to swell, Carter took a step forward, unsure of what to do or say. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling all the eyes on him, watching his every move. I think you're mistaken," Carter said, his voice louder than he intended. He forced a smile, though it felt thin, rehearsed. "I'm not," but the woman stepped forward quickly, her gaze locking with his in a way that stopped him mid-sentence. She was calm, almost too calm, but there was an undercurrent of desperation in her voice as she spoke. "He's not mistaken," she said softly, her words slow but deliberate. "Luca is your son." The words hit Carter like a cold wave, his mind scrambling to process them. His gaze flickered back to the boy, Then to the woman, Isla Thompson, she finally introduced herself. The name didn't ring any bells, but her face tugged at something inside him, some dim memory he couldn't quite place. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His thoughts felt jumbled, but one thing was clear. This was no joke. The gala's ambient chatter had faded into the background, leaving only the sound of his own racing heart in his ears. "I think there's some mistake here," Carter said, the confusion starting to turn into irritation. "I don't know who you are, and I definitely don't know this boy." Isla didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes softened with a quiet sadness, as if she had expected him to say exactly that. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But we had a brief relationship. I didn't want to disrupt your life." "But Luca, he's yours, Carter." Carter's mind raced, trying to piece together a memory that was buried too deep to bring to the surface. He felt a knot form in his stomach. This woman, this child, was it possible? He'd never been reckless in his personal life, or at least he didn't think so. He had always been too careful, too focused on work, on the company, on everything that kept him too busy to remember his past mistakes. But this felt like something he couldn't ignore. Lucas stood there, silent now, still looking at Carter with wide eyes, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. Carter looked down at the child, then back at Isla. He wasn't sure if he felt anger, confusion, or just trapped. The room around them seemed to fade into the background as Carter forced himself to focus. "I need some time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll talk later." "This is too much." Isla nodded quietly, her face unreadable. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as the two of them walked away, the child's small hand gripping hers. The murmur of the crowd slowly picked up again, but Carter couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back. The phone call came the next morning, just as Carter was finishing his coffee in the quiet solitude of his penthouse. He stared out at the skyline, watching the sun gradually climb over the city, casting long shadows across his sleek, modern living room. He had hoped the previous night's incident would be nothing more than a strange blip, an embarrassment really, a misunderstanding that would blow over. But when the name Isla Thompson flashed across his phone screen, his stomach churned with an unease he couldn't shake. He answered the call, his voice clipped, still feeling the sting of disbelief from the gala. "Carter, it's Isla. I know you're probably not ready for this, but I need you to listen." Her voice was steady but tinged with urgency. "I wasn't trying to shock you last night. It's true. Luca is your son." Carter's grip tightened around the mug. He had barely slept, tossing and turning, replaying every moment of the gala. The boy's piercing eyes, his insistence. "You're my dad." The words still echoed in his mind. Could it really be true? The idea that he had fathered a child and never known it seemed absurd, impossible. And yet, Isla's voice had been so certain. "I told you this would be hard for you to believe," Isla continued. "But Carter, you have a son. I've never asked you for anything. I've never reached out, and I've kept Luca away from your world because I didn't think you'd want him in it. But now, I need you to face this." He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of his own cynicism. The life he had built wasn't just about business and success. It was about control. And this was out of his control. A child, an unexpected link to a past he hadn't even remembered, threatened to unravel everything. He had carefully crafted his reputation, had guarded his privacy fiercely, and now, just when everything seemed to be going as planned, a stranger appeared at his doorstep with the audacity to change his life. "You need to prove it." Carter's voice was tight, his jaw clenched. The thought of being dragged into a legal battle over a child he didn't even remember fathering filled him with a mix of dread and disbelief. "A DNA test. If you want me to believe this, we need a test." "I'm not asking for anything else," Isla replied softly. "I don't want your money, Carter. I just need you to know the truth. For Luca's sake." Carter didn't say anything for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He had always been someone who dealt with problems by throwing money at them or manipulating his way out of them. But this felt different. He wasn't sure if it was the child's eyes that had unsettled him, or if it was the knowledge that a part of his past had come back to haunt him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt utterly powerless. "I'll agree to the test," Carter finally said, his voice a mixture of frustration and resignation. "But I want it to be done properly. No games." "I understand," Isla said. There was a pause, and Carter could almost hear the relief in her voice. But it was quickly replaced with the same determined edge. "I'll have my lawyer arrange everything. We'll do it soon." The following days were a blur of tension. Carter had every intention of brushing off this entire ordeal, of letting the DNA test prove the ridiculousness of Isla's claims. But something gnawed at him. The child, Luca, had looked up at him with such certainty the night before. How could anyone mistake a billionaire like Carter for their father? There was something about the boy that felt real. Not a game. Not a lie. Carter had been in control for so long, living in a world of sharp edges and calculated risks. But this was unpredictable, like a storm on the horizon he couldn't avoid. The morning of the test, Carter stood in front of a sterile, white building, the laboratory where the samples would be taken. The lab technician, a middle-aged man with glasses and a clipboard, greeted him politely, but Carter's mind was miles away. His hand brushed against his jacket pocket, with a note Isla had handed him the day before still rested. He didn't want to be here, but there he was. He thought about Isla, her quiet determination. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. She wasn't trying to trap him into something. She was, in her own way, asking for something he didn't know how to give. Trust. When the technician led him to a small room, Carter sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair, trying to ignore the swirling thoughts in his head. He couldn't shake the image of Luca's face, the boy's eyes staring up at him with an unspoken plea for recognition, for validation. "Mr. Wells?" The technician's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Yeah, sorry." Carter cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus. "Let's get this over with." The test would take a few days, but Carter's mind was already working overtime. Every part of him wanted to dismiss the whole thing as absurd. The DNA test would come back negative. It had to. He hadn't fathered any children, at least not that he could remember. But then a gnawing fear started to creep in. What if the test came back positive? What if Luca was in fact his son? And if he was, then what? What did that mean for Carter's life? His empire? His carefully constructed world? Would it all change? Carter sat in his office, the phone buzzing on the desk beside him, but he didn't dare pick it up. His mind was elsewhere, circling around the same question that had been haunting him for the past few days. What if it's true? The DNA test. The results. Could the boy really be his? He had gone through the motions, taking the test with Isla and Luca in a small clinic. His mind numb as the technician swabbed his cheek and Luca's, a clinical reminder of just how far this had all spiraled out of control. Carter had refused to let himself dwell on it. After all, it had to be some mistake, right? The child's insistence, Isla's desperation. It all felt like some sort of poorly planned scheme, something he could shake off with a few harsh words and an ironclad defense. But when the phone call finally came, his stomach dropped. "Mr. Wells." The voice on the other end was neutral, the tone reserved, but there was an undercurrent of finality. "The results are in. I'm afraid the test confirms what we feared. Luca Thompson is indeed your biological son." The world tilted. Carter could feel the weight of those words land, not just in his chest, but deep in his bones. His hand shook slightly as he placed the phone back on its receiver. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how small the space around him felt. The high-rise office, once a symbol of everything he had built, now seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in, the gleaming city skyline through the windows mocking him with its untouchable beauty. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had spent years constructing this perfect, impenetrable fortress, his work, his ambition, his carefully controlled personal life. Nothing had ever breached it. And now this, a child he didn't even remember having, one he hadn't known existed, suddenly demanding a place in his life. Carter had always prided himself on his ability to control everything. His business, his image, his future. Even when his marriage to Nina had crumbled, even when Sophie had been taken, he had maintained control. But this was something different. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a financial transaction or by flexing his power. The reality of a child, his son, had shattered that illusion. He hadn't expected it to hurt. The news had come as a shock. Yes, but pain? That wasn't part of the plan. Yet, as he sat there in silence, something heavy gnawed at him. He had known something was missing from his life, but he hadn't realized how deep that emptiness ran until now. The thought of Luca, his son, flashed in his mind, and the pit in his stomach deepened. What kind of father had he been? What kind of man had he been, letting this child grow up without even knowing he existed? A sudden wave of guilt washed over him. He hadn't even seen Luca's face clearly until that night at the gala, but now, with the test results in hand, everything was different. Carter had spent years hiding behind his success, pushing away everything that could make him vulnerable. And now, it was all crashing down around him. He thought of Isla. What had her life been like, raising Luca alone? The more he thought about it, the more questions flooded his mind. Why had she never told him? Was she afraid of him? Or was there more to the story that he didn't know? She had said she kept Luca away from his world for a reason. Carter had assumed it was because of some selfish desire to protect her son from a man like him. But now, after the test results, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. The past few years had been filled with work, endless meetings, and unfulfilled promises to himself that he would take time to relax, to actually live. But now he couldn't even remember what that had felt like. He had always prided himself on not needing anyone, on being able to handle anything life threw his way. And yet here he was with a son he didn't know, a woman who seemed to know more about his past than he did, and an entire life that now felt like it had been built on lies. Carter rubbed his temples, trying to suppress the headache that threatened to rise. He knew what needed to be done. He had to face Isla. He had to face Luca. But the thought of all the unknowns, the complications, the lies, the broken pieces of his life, felt like too much to process in one moment. The phone buzzed again, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. It was Isla. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The moment Carter stepped into the small, warmly lit living room of Isla's apartment, everything felt different. The sharp, pristine lines of his own home, the polished glass, the minimalist decor were absent here. Instead, there was warmth, soft, inviting colors, framed photographs of a life lived quietly but with purpose. And then there was Luca. The boy was playing on the floor, his concentration fixed on a puzzle. He didn't look up when Carter entered, his small hands fumbling with the pieces as he worked through the challenge, completely absorbed in his world. For a long moment, Carter just stood there in the doorway, unsure what to do, feeling like an outsider in a life he had never known. Isla, standing in the kitchen, glanced over her shoulder. "Luca," she called softly. "Look who's here." At the sound of his name, the boy paused, then slowly turned his head. His eyes met Carter's, and something in that brief exchange stopped Carter's breath in his throat. There was no immediate recognition, no overwhelming sense of connection. Just a simple, curious look, as if the boy was trying to figure out who this stranger was standing in his home. "Hi," Carter said, his voice sounding foreign even to him. It wasn't just the shock of the situation. It was the weight of the moment. The reality that this child, this small, innocent boy, was his flesh and blood. How was that even possible? How had he never known about him? Luca didn't answer at first. He merely blinked, his gaze flicking to his mother for reassurance. Isla gave him a gentle smile, a smile Carter had never seen directed at him. Not in this way. She crouched down beside Luca, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "This is your dad." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Carter could barely breathe. "Your dad." The phrase sounded strange coming from her, as if it wasn't meant for him at all. It was something he couldn't quite process. He was supposed to be a father. He had always envisioned fatherhood as a distant concept, something meant for other people. But now, standing here in the middle of Isla's modest apartment, it was all too real. Luca's gaze shifted back to Carter, and then he tilted his head, as if examining him, weighing him in some quiet, childlike way. His fingers went back to the puzzle pieces, but he didn't make any effort to continue. He just stared, his big, curious eyes now focused on Carter with an intensity that almost felt like an accusation. For a long moment, Carter stood frozen. How was he supposed to do this? What was he supposed to say to a child he had never known? A child who had spent the last 5 years of his life without his father, without the man who was supposed to be there. There was no playbook for this. Isla watched the two of them, a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe apprehension, maybe hope, but it was quickly masked behind the calm exterior she had maintained for so long. She stepped closer to Carter, her voice low but steady. He doesn't know much about you. I didn't tell him because I didn't want to give him false hope. But now you both need to figure this out. The words stung. They weren't meant to, but they did. You both need to figure this out. The implication was clear. There was no easy way forward. It wasn't just about paternity or the test results. It was about the years that had already passed, the life Luca had lived without him. It was about the mess that was already created and whether it was possible to untangle it, to weave a relationship where there had been nothing but silence. Carter crouched down slowly, taking a hesitant step toward Luca. He reached out a hand, unsure if he was doing the right thing. "Hey, Luca," he said, his voice softer now, unsure but trying. I'm your dad." The boy looked up at him again, this time with a small, uncertain smile. He didn't say anything, but there was a slight nod, a brief moment of recognition. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Carter felt a strange pang in his chest. It was a beginning, he realized, a small, fragile one, but a beginning nonetheless. Isla watched them both in silence, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. She looked between the two men, the son she had raised alone, the man who had unknowingly fathered him. And in that moment, Carter understood just how much had been lost, how much had been missed. "I'm sorry," Carter muttered, more to himself than to either of them. He didn't know what else to say. "I'm sorry." It didn't seem like enough, but it was all he could manage. Isla's gaze softened for the first time since they had met again. "You'll figure it out," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "Luca needs you to try. He's already waited long enough." And in that moment, Carter knew she was right. There was no turning back. He had a son, and no matter how unexpected, how difficult, this was his responsibility now. But the question that still lingered in his mind was simple. Could he be the father Luca needed? Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back, the quiet tension between Carter and Isla was palpable as they sat across from each other in the small, cozy living room. The silence stretched between them, neither of them sure what to say. Carter kept his gaze fixed on Luca, who was now back on the floor with his puzzle, but it was clear he wasn't truly seeing the child. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the years that had passed, on the lies he never knew had been told, and on Isla's words, which had echoed through his mind ever since their first conversation. "I never wanted you to know, Carter." Isla's voice broke through the silence. Her words were careful, measured, as though she were choosing each one with the utmost precision. She had avoided the subject for years, but now, with everything out in the open, it seemed like the only way forward was honesty. Carter's jaw tightened, and he shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. "You never wanted me to know? Why? Why didn't you tell me?" Isla's eyes flickered to the side, avoiding his gaze. "It wasn't about keeping him from you. It was about keeping him safe." She paused, taking a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "You have no idea what your family is like. Your father, Carter, he's dangerous. He's the reason I left the way I did." The mention of Carter's father brought a familiar, bitter taste to his mouth. It was no secret that his father, Theodore Wells, was a controlling, ruthless man who had spent his entire life manipulating others to expand the family's empire. Carter had grown up in that shadow, always striving to break free from it, but also feeling the constant pressure of his father's expectations. For years, he had distanced himself from the man, refusing to let him control his business decisions, his life, or his future. But even now, Theodore's influence lingered, like a dark cloud, hovering over everything. "You think I didn't know what he was capable of?" Carter's voice was colder now, edged with frustration. He leaned forward, hands clasped tightly in his lap. You think I don't understand what it means to be trapped by that kind of power? Isla nodded slowly, the weight of her own experiences clear in her eyes. You may think you've escaped him, Carter, but your name, your wealth, it's all tied to him. And he, your father, he would have never let you have a child with someone like me, someone he couldn't control. He would have seen it as a threat to his legacy. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Carter understood. Isla wasn't just keeping Luca from him to protect herself. She was protecting him from the same force that had shaped Carter's entire existence. She was protecting Luca from the well's name, from the power and the darkness that came with it. So you kept him from me for his sake? Carter's voice softened, a thread of understanding weaving through his anger. It was a bitter truth, but it was one he could no longer deny. His family's legacy was built on lies, manipulation, and control, and he had unwittingly become a part of that cycle. Isla met his gaze now, her expression unreadable. Yes, I didn't want him to grow up like you did, feeling like nothing more than a pawn in a game that you never asked to play. I wanted him to have a chance at something different, something better. Carter swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He looked over at Luca, who had now abandoned the puzzle to look out the window, his small fingers pressed against the glass as he watched the city below. The child seemed so innocent, so unaware of the world around him. And yet, in that moment, Carter realized just how much was at stake. He wasn't just facing the fallout of a mistake from his past. He was staring down the consequences of a life he hadn't chosen for himself, and a son who had been forced to navigate a world he was never meant to understand. "I'm sorry," Carter murmured, the apology feeling inadequate. But it was the only thing he could offer in the face of everything Isla had endured. "I didn't know." Isla looked at him, her eyes softening. "I know you didn't, but now you do." She paused, her voice turning a little more resolute. "And now you have a choice, Carter. You can be part of Luca's life, or you can walk away. But whatever you choose, he deserves to know the truth about who he is. About you." For the first time since all this had begun, Carter felt a flicker of something inside him, something that resembled hope. It was fragile, barely there, but it was enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could build something different, something better. For Luca, the next few days were a blur for Carter. His mind oscillated between disbelief and anger, confusion and guilt. Every time he looked at Luca, a knot tightened in his chest. The boy was a stranger to him, and yet, the more time he spent with him, the more he saw his own reflection in Luca's curious eyes, the same small quirks, the same unspoken expressions. It was as though there was an undeniable link, a bloodline Carter couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. Isla had invited him to spend more time with Luca, but Carter was reluctant, afraid of what he might uncover. The realization that he had a child, one who had grown up without him, without his influence, without any of the things he had worked so hard to provide for others, felt like a slap in the face. There was no time in his life for fatherhood. There had been no space for a family, not in the way he had imagined at least. Everything he had built, every deal he had closed, every empire he had expanded, seemed like a hollow victory in comparison to what was unfolding in front of him. He could still remember the night he had met Isla, years ago, at a conference in Monaco. It had been a whirlwind romance, quick, intense, passionate, and completely unexpected. Isla had been a young woman just starting her career in marketing, working for a rival tech firm. The chemistry between them had been undeniable, but Carter had always kept one foot out the door. He wasn't interested in anything permanent. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, but he had made it clear from the start that he was too focused on his work to offer anything long-term. The memories of that brief affair were still hazy, though. Carter had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his life: business, pleasure, personal affairs. He kept everything separate, neatly tied up in boxes. And Isla had been just another chapter, one that closed as quickly as it had opened. He never imagined it would lead to this. But now, as he sat across from Isla in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of her words hit him like a freight train. "I didn't want him to grow up in that world," Isla confessed, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a deep sadness. The world you come from, it's toxic, Carter. Your father's empire isn't just built on money. It's built on lies, manipulation, and power at any cost. When I found out I was pregnant with Luca, I made a choice. I couldn't let him be part of that. Carter felt a pang of anger rise in his chest. His father, always the omnipresent shadow in his life. But this time, the anger wasn't directed at the man who had shaped his future, but at Isla, who had hidden his son from him all these years. "Why didn't you trust me?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "Why keep him from me? I could have helped. I could have." "You don't understand," Isla interrupted, her voice urgent. "You don't know what it's like to have a man like that looking over your shoulder, trying to control every part of your life. The day I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to get away. I couldn't risk your father finding out, couldn't risk him using Luca as leverage." Carter's mind raced. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about his father's ruthlessness, but Isla's words struck a different chord. His father had always seen Carter as a tool, a means to an end, and he had always expected Carter to follow in his footsteps. But this was something darker. Isla was telling him that his father wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who would stop at nothing to protect his power, even if it meant destroying the lives of those who stood in his way. "You think I'm like him?" Carter asked, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. Isla shook her head. Her expression softened with the weight of the years she had carried this secret. "No, Carter, but I didn't know that back then. I didn't know if you would protect him, or if he would turn out just like your father." The silence between them stretched again, both of them caught in the gravity of the revelations that had been brought to light. Carter leaned back in his chair, the implications of Isla's words settling heavily in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. For the first time in years, he questioned everything he thought he knew about himself. The thought of Luca, his son, living a life hidden from him, a life without a father, without guidance, felt like a failure Carter couldn't undo. He had built his empire, achieved everything he ever wanted, but this was different. This wasn't something that could be solved with money or power. "I'm sorry," Carter whispered, the words more painful than he could have imagined. I didn't know what you were going through." Isla nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I know, and I didn't want to keep him from you forever, but I had to make sure he was safe." Her gaze shifted toward Luca, still playing with his puzzle, unaware of the conversation that was unfolding between the two adults. "I wanted him to have a chance at a normal life." Carter looked at the boy, then really looked at him, seeing more than just the puzzle pieces in his hands. He saw the possibility of a future he had never expected, a future he didn't know if he was ready for. But he had no choice now. This wasn't just about Isla, or even his father. This was about Luca, and Carter realized, with a sharp clarity that stunned him, that he had to make a choice. He could no longer run from the past, nor could he hide from the reality of the child he had brought into the world. "I'm here now," Carter said, his voice more certain than he felt. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Isla met his gaze, her eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. It wasn't going to be easy. There were too many years of hurt, too many unknowns, too much history to overcome. But for the first time, Carter felt like he was standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. Days turned into weeks, and still, Carter felt as though he were walking through a fog. The weight of Luca's existence hung over him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Each time he looked at the boy, it felt as though the ground beneath him shifted, like he was being pulled into a world he hadn't prepared for. Every smile Luca gave, every laugh, every tiny gesture was a reminder that this child, this little boy, was his responsibility now. And yet, Carter felt utterly unprepared. Isla had been patient with him, giving him space to process, but it was clear she was growing frustrated. She wanted more than just a distant, aloof figure in Luca's life. She wanted Carter to be a father. And somewhere, buried under his shock and anger, Carter knew that Isla was right. Luca deserved more than a stranger who came in and out of his life whenever it was convenient. It was late one evening when Carter found himself standing outside Isla's apartment building, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. The sky was dark, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by. His mind raced as he stared up at the window of the apartment where Isla and Luca lived. He hadn't intended to come here, but the weight of the responsibility of fatherhood had been gnawing at him in ways he couldn't ignore. He had always prided himself on being in control, on keeping his personal life as neatly compartmentalized as his professional one. But Luca was different. Luca was a part of him, whether he liked it or not. And that meant he had to decide what kind of father he wanted to be. He wasn't even sure what he expected when he knocked on the door. Isla answered almost immediately, her face a mixture of surprise and relief. "Carter," she said, her voice soft, but tinged with a wariness he couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking," he said, his words coming out more measured than he felt. "I'm not sure what the hell I'm doing. But Luca deserves more than just a visitor. He deserves a father." Isla didn't speak right away. Her eyes searched his face, looking for sincerity, perhaps testing him. After a long silence, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside, Luca was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his favorite toy. He looked up as Carter entered, his wide brown eyes studying him intently. Carter felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them, how to turn this awkward moment into something real. But there was no turning back now. For the first time, Carter knelt down in front of Luca. "Hey, buddy," he said, trying to make his voice sound casual. "How's the puzzle coming along?" Luca didn't respond right away, his small hands continuing to move the pieces, fitting them together with a concentration that reminded Carter of himself. There was something about the way the boy worked so meticulously, so absorbed in his task, that made Carter's heart ache. "Want some help?" Carter asked, more to break the silence than anything else. Luca paused, glancing at him before nodding. He slid a piece toward Carter, who hesitated for a moment before reaching for it. His fingers brushed against Luca's small hand, and for the first time, Carter felt the weight of what this child, this son, represented. "Thanks," Luca mumbled, his voice soft but sincere. It was the first word of acknowledgement he'd given Carter since they'd met, and it made something inside Carter loosen. As they worked together on the puzzle, Carter began to realize something. It wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't just sweep this under the rug, couldn't pretend that everything would be fine with a few gestures and promises. Being Luca's father meant making real choices, making himself vulnerable in ways he wasn't used to. It meant stepping outside of his carefully controlled life and embracing something far more chaotic, far more unpredictable. But it also meant he had a chance to make something right. Isla watched from the doorway, her eyes softening as she saw the tentative connection forming between the two of them. For a brief moment, Carter allowed himself to believe that maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this was the part of his life he had been too afraid to face. For the first time in weeks, Carter didn't feel like he was being dragged along by a series of unavoidable circumstances. He felt, for the first time in a long while, like he had a choice. And as he looked up at Isla, he knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Luca. "I'll be here," Carter said quietly, his voice more certain than it had been in days. "I'll be here for him. And for you if you'll let me." Isla gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an easy acceptance, but it was a start. And in that moment, Carter knew that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The days following Carter's visit to Isla's apartment were filled with an uneasy tension. He had promised himself he wouldn't get emotionally involved. His life was set in stone, focused on his work, his company, his projects. Being a father wasn't part of the plan. But now, Luca had been inserted into his carefully orchestrated world, a constant reminder of his past mistakes and his present uncertainties. Despite his reluctance, Carter found himself drawn to the idea of being there for Luca. It wasn't about playing the role of a father in the conventional sense. It was more about understanding what had happened in his absence. He began visiting Isla's apartment more often, though each time he walked through the door, he felt like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. Luca, on the other hand, seemed to accept him with ease. as if nothing was unusual about the situation. He'd run up to Carter with a bright smile, tugging at his sleeve, eager to show him his latest drawing or to share a toy car. And for the first time in years, Carter felt something stir inside him, a deep, instinctual urge to protect this boy, to give him everything he never had. But even as he tried to allow himself to feel that connection, the walls of resistance within him remained firm. Isla watched all of this with a quiet patience, but Carter could sense the unspoken frustration in her. She had spent years doing everything on her own, carrying the weight of both raising Luca and protecting him from the dangerous realities of Carter's past. She had kept him away from his father's shadow, fearing that the Wells name, rich with power and corruption, would taint her son's future. Isla's decision to raise Luca without Carter's involvement had never been easy, and now, watching him try to step into the role of a father, she struggled with the complex emotions of resentment and hope. She was grateful that Carter was finally stepping up, but there was also a sharp edge of bitterness. How could he expect to just walk back into their lives after all this time? Had he truly changed? Or was this just another attempt to salvage a reputation he hadn't cared to build in the first place? One evening, after Luca had gone to bed, Isla sat across from Carter on the small couch, her expression tired but determined. You can't just play at being a father, Carter. You can't show up when it's convenient for you, when you feel like it. Luca deserves more than that. Carter leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of her words sinking in. I know, he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. I'm trying. This is all new to me, but I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want it. Isla's gaze softened, but her tone remained steady. Neither did I, but I've been doing it alone for years. And if you want to be a part of his life now, you have to commit to it. It's not about you, Carter. It's about him. About us. We're already a family. I'm not going to let you play catch up. Her words hit him harder than he expected. A part of him had always believed he could control everything. His career, his reputation, his relationships. But this was different. Luca wasn't something he could just fix with money or charm. He wasn't some new business venture he could mold and shape into what he wanted. This was real, and it demanded more than Carter had ever been willing to give. For the first time, Carter felt a flicker of guilt. He wasn't used to feeling inadequate. In his world, power was the answer to every problem. But in this world, with Isla and Luca, his wealth didn't matter. His name didn't matter. What mattered was the kind of man he chose to be now, what kind of father he could become. I'm not asking you to do this alone, Carter said quietly, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. I'm not asking you to forgive me for the past, but I want to try. I want to be here for him. For both of you. Isla studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched out, and Carter couldn't help but wonder if she would shut him out again. But when she spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than he had heard it before. I'm not asking for perfection, Carter. I just want you to be real with us. To show up when it counts. Carter nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. But as he looked over at Luca's bedroom door, a sense of resolve began to take root. This wasn't going to be easy. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. But for the first time in his life, Carter realized there was something worth fighting for. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the tension between Carter and Isla grew more palpable with each passing day, though neither of them spoke about it directly. It was as if they were both waiting for something, a shift, a moment of clarity that would allow them to finally understand their new reality. But that moment never seemed to come. Instead, every interaction between them only added layers of complexity to a situation neither had prepared for. Carter found himself torn between his instincts as a businessman and the raw emotions he was beginning to feel toward Luca. Isla had been clear from the start. Luca needs a father. But for Carter, the concept of fatherhood still felt foreign, like a role he was being forced into without any preparation. He had been a part of Luca's life for all of a few weeks, and yet every time he saw the boy, something deep within him stirred, a mix of guilt and awe. How had he not known about Luca? How had he lived his life for so long, without understanding that a part of him had been quietly growing up in the shadows. Yet, as much as he struggled to embrace this new responsibility, Carter knew he couldn't continue to live in the limbo he had created. His desire to be present for Luca was genuine, but it was also tainted with uncertainty. What did it mean to be a father, especially when you had spent so long distancing yourself from anything that could tie you down? How could he provide for Luca when he didn't even know what kind of father he was supposed to be? Isla had tried to explain it time and again in the quiet moments they shared after Luca had gone to bed. She spoke about the sacrifices she'd made, the pain of raising Luca alone, and how every decision she had made had been for his protection. Carter listened, but the weight of her words often felt like a heavy burden pressing against him. She had built a life without him, without his money, without his influence. Isla had made a life for her son that was free from the manipulations of his family, free from the cold, calculated world Carter had come from. But Isla wasn't just a mother to Luca. She was also a woman who had loved Carter once, a woman who had spent years in the shadow of their brief affair, and who had chosen to raise their son without ever asking him for help. For all of her strength, there was a quiet pain in her eyes whenever they spoke. It was clear to Carter that she resented him for not being there, for not stepping up when Luca needed him most. Yet at the same time, there was something almost fragile in the way she let him in. She wanted to believe that he could be the man she needed him to be, but she had been burned before. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, Isla finally confronted him. "You don't have to do this, Carter," she said, her voice unexpectedly soft, though the words carried the weight of years of frustration. "You don't have to pretend to be something you're not. If you're not ready, if this isn't something you want, it's okay. Luca deserves more than just a half-hearted attempt at fatherhood." The words hit Carter harder than he expected. For a moment, he wanted to argue, to deny the accusation, to say he was trying. But something inside him stopped him. He wasn't trying. He had been living in his own self-made bubble, expecting that everything would fall into place just because the DNA results said Luca was his. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Isla's gaze was steady, unwavering, but there was something else behind her eyes, a quiet sadness. She wasn't angry, not in the way he had expected, but there was a quiet resignation there, a sense that she had already given up on him. And that cut deeper than anything he had felt in years. Carter took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it head-on. He had spent his whole life running from his emotions, burying everything under the guise of business, of success. But now, for the first time in his life, he realized that success didn't mean a thing without the people who mattered. And Luca mattered. He looked at Isla, his expression softer now. "I'm not pretending, Isla," he said quietly. I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to learn." For him, for Luca, it wasn't a perfect promise. He wasn't sure how he would navigate the storm that was coming, or what kind of father he would be. But in that moment, he understood something he had never considered before. Fatherhood wasn't just about blood or biology. It was about the choices you made, the actions you took. And Carter had to start making those choices now. As the evening stretched into night, Carter realized that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was one he couldn't turn away from. He wasn't sure how long it would take for him to get it right, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't running anymore. The journey had only just begun. It was late one afternoon, just as the golden light of dusk began to spill into Isla's apartment, that Carter finally found a moment of clarity. He was sitting on the small couch, Luca nestled beside him, a picture book opened on his lap. The boy was pointing to the colorful illustrations, chattering excitedly about the animals, but Carter wasn't really paying attention to the story. Instead, he was absorbed in something far more important: the feeling of Luca's hand resting on his own, small and trusting, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. For a long time, Carter had thought he was invincible, that he could control everything in his life: his company, his relationships, his future. But this moment with Luca was different. This was not something he could control, not something he could strategize or manipulate. This was raw, real, and unexpectedly fragile. Luca looked up at him, his wide eyes brimming with innocence and expectation. "Dad," he said simply, his voice small but filled with affection. It was a word Carter had never thought he would hear, at least not directed at him. He felt a strange ache in his chest, a swelling of emotions he had long buried. He looked at Isla, who was standing by the kitchen counter, watching them both with a quiet smile on her face. Isla had been patient with him, giving him time to come to terms with the reality of his paternity, and Carter knew he would never be able to fully understand the weight of her decisions. She had raised Luca on her own, carrying the responsibility of motherhood without asking for anything in return. And now, here they were, navigating the complexities of their new family dynamic together. "I didn't know what to expect," Carter said, his voice unexpectedly hoarse as he gazed at Isla. "But I think I'm starting to understand." Isla set down the dish she had been washing, her hands still dripping with water, and walked over to him. There was no anger in her gaze, no frustration, just a quiet understanding, as if she knew he was finally finding his place. She knelt beside the couch, looking at Luca with the same warmth she had always shown him, and then turned her attention back to Carter. "You don't have to have it all figured out right away. No one does. But what matters is that you're here now. That's all Luca needs." Carter nodded slowly, the enormity of the moment settling in. He had spent so many years building walls, erecting barriers between himself and the world, afraid to let anyone get too close. But now, as he looked at Luca's trusting face, those walls started to crumble. The fear, the uncertainty, they were still there, lurking in the background, but they no longer controlled him. He had a family now, whether he had planned for it or not, and that family needed him. "What happens now?" Carter asked, looking at Isla with genuine curiosity. Isla smiled softly, the warmth in her expression growing as she took a seat beside him. Now we take it one day at a time. We figure this out together, one step at a time." For the first time in weeks, Carter felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future wasn't a road he could map out with his usual precision, but in that moment he realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to stop trying to control everything and instead start living in the uncertainty of what was to come. The evening drifted on quietly. Luca fell asleep on the couch, his head nestled against Carter's side, as if he knew he was finally where he belonged. Carter sat there, watching the boy's gentle breathing, feeling the weight of the responsibility begin to settle comfortably on his shoulders. He had always been good at managing empires, but this was different. This wasn't about control, it was about connection. As the soft glow of the lamp bathed the room, Carter turned to Isla, a quiet promise in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady now, with a newfound sense of certainty. Isla met his gaze, and for the first time, Carter could see the relief in her eyes. The weight of years of silence, of secrets and uncertainty, seemed to lift in that simple exchange. And for the first time, Carter knew with a deep, unshakable certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Weeks had passed since Carter had begun visiting Luca and Isla regularly. But each time he walked into their apartment, something new about the experience began to settle in him, slowly and deeply. At first, he had approached his role as a father with hesitation, perhaps even skepticism. His life had been built on control and precision, on making strategic decisions and maintaining order. But fatherhood, he realized, was nothing like that. It wasn't a transaction. It was a process of vulnerability, learning, and adjustment. It was a role he could never simply manage or plan. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Luca looked up at Carter with a question that jolted him more than it should have. "Will you come to my soccer game, Dad?" Luca asked, his voice hopeful, his small face filled with innocence and trust. The question was simple, yet for Carter, it was a milestone. This was not just a casual request. It was an invitation, a subtle expectation from the child who was starting to see Carter not just as a figure of mystery, but as someone who could be counted on. Carter's heart stuttered. The question itself didn't scare him. It was the deeper, unspoken truth that was now glaringly obvious. Luca was asking him to be present, to participate in his life, to show up in ways Carter had never had to before. For so long, His life had been a series of meetings, conference calls, and business trips. The idea of something as simple as a child's soccer game seemed like an inconvenient distraction from the constant, never-ending demands of his empire. But then he looked at Luca, at the way the boy's eyes brightened as he waited for an answer, and something inside Carter shifted. "Yeah," Carter said, his voice softer than he intended. "I'll be there, Luca." The promise felt heavy, and for the first time, Carter realized that the weight of this commitment wasn't a burden. It was a gift. It was a chance to finally be present in a way he had never been before, to build something meaningful with the child who had waited for him all this time. The next Saturday, Carter drove with Isla and Luca to the soccer field. It was a small, local game, nothing that would attract the press or the high society crowd Carter was used to. And yet, as he sat on the bleachers, watching Luca run and kick the ball with wild energy, Carter felt a profound sense of pride. The boy was full of life, not only physically but emotionally too. He was learning, growing, and becoming a little more of his own person with each passing day. Isla was beside him, her gaze flicking to Carter from time to time, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Carter could feel the weight of her quiet approval, but more importantly, he felt something else, a connection to Luca that transcended biology. It was as though, in that moment, he understood what Isla had tried to explain all those weeks ago. Being a father wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having all the answers or knowing exactly what to do. It was about showing up. It was about being there consistently, even in the small, everyday moments. It was about commitment, no matter how daunting the path might seem. After the game, they all went for ice cream, Luca bouncing between them with excitement. Carter listened as Luca babbled on about his teammates and the game, his small face flushed with happiness. And Carter realized, with a jolt, that he was beginning to enjoy these moments. They were simple, nothing extravagant, no grand gestures or opulent experiences. But they were real. They were a connection that didn't require wealth or power, just time, attention, and genuine care. In the days that followed, Carter's commitment to Luca grew deeper. He began to rearrange his schedule to ensure that he was there for the important moments in Luca's life, attending school plays, helping him with homework, or simply spending an afternoon at the park. At work, he started delegating more, relying on trusted colleagues to manage the empire he had spent years building. There was still the pressure to perform, the drive to succeed, but for the first time, Carter felt a shift in priorities. He wasn't sacrificing his career. He was learning to balance it with his newfound role as a father. And with each new day, Carter found that Luca was not just a reminder of his past mistakes. Luca was a doorway to a future he never imagined. A future that wasn't about the endless chase for success or the need to prove his worth, but about the love and fulfillment he could create in this small, quiet life he was building with Isla and Luca. As Carter sat with Luca one evening, reading him a book before bed, he looked up to find Isla watching him. There was a warmth in her eyes, a quiet understanding that passed between them. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew. He had made a choice to be there, to show up, and to build the kind of family he had never thought possible. And for the first time in years, Carter felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.